when wildlife officials in Florida announced they were letting loose thousands more snakes into a state already crawling with them. People didn't know whether to laugh or panic. Comment sections filled up overnight. Late-night hosts made it a punchline. To most of the country, it sounded like the setup to a disaster movie, not a conservation plan. But the people mocking the decision were missing the real story completely. Florida wasn't adding to its problem. It was quietly trying to fix one of the worst ecological disasters in American history, and it was doing so with the one creature built to undo the damage. To understand why anyone would fight snakes with snakes, you have to go back to where everything started falling apart. The Everglades used to be one of the most complete wild ecosystems left in North America. Sawgrass prairies rolled out for miles, dotted with tree islands, alligator holes, and shallow water that shimmered under the Florida sun. Wading birds filled the skies. Deer moved through the hammocks. Bobcats hunted at dusk, and marsh rabbits darted through the underbrush without a second thought. It was a functioning machine, millions of years in the making, and economists later put its yearly value to the region at well over $30 billion once you counted fishing, tourism, drinking water, and flood protection. Nobody was watching for the thing that would eventually break it. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore across South Florida with catastrophic force, flattening entire neighborhoods and demolishing a commercial reptile facility near Miami in the process. Snakes that had been bred and housed there simply vanished into the wetlands. Nobody thought to look for them. Around the same period, exotic pet owners who could no longer manage full-grown Burmese pythons were quietly releasing them into canals and marshes, assuming the humane thing to do was set them free. For a while, it looked harmless. A python here, a python there. Nobody connected the dots. By the 2000s, the dots had connected themselves. What had begun as a handful of escaped and abandoned pets had become a self-sustaining population, and it was growing at a pace nobody had planned for. A single female python can lay close to 100 eggs in one clutch, and with no natural predator willing or able to challenge a full-grown constrictor, survival rates were brutal in the snake's favor. Estimates today place the wild population somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 animals spread across South Florida, hidden in grass, tucked into burrows, and nearly impossible to spot even by trained searchers. The damage showed up in the numbers first. Raccoon sightings collapsed by more than 99% in areas with heavy python activity. Possums fell by close to the same margin. Bobcat numbers dropped by nearly 90%, and marsh rabbits all but disappeared from surveys that once counted them by the dozen. Deer, once common enough to barely notice, became a rare find. The Everglades wasn't just losing animals. It was losing the relationships between them, the small transactions of predator and prey that keep a wetland breathing. And because pythons are ambush hunters, patient and nearly invisible in tall grass, most of this collapse happened without anyone actually watching it happen. The swamp simply got quieter, year after year, until researchers realized the silence itself was the warning sign. Florida did not sit on its hands. Starting in the early 2010s, the state opened its doors to hunters, biologists, and ordinary residents willing to spend nights wading through waist-deep water in search of snakes. The Florida Python Challenge turned into an annual event, drawing competitors from across the country and even from Canada, all chasing a cash prize and bragging rights for the biggest haul. In a strong year, competitors might remove a couple hundred pythons in 10 days. It made headlines. It made for great television. It barely moved the needle. The state also brought in professionals. Contract hunters were hired to patrol the wetlands full-time, tracking, trapping, and removing pythons as a paid job rather than a weekend hobby. Wildlife agencies experimented with methods that sounded almost like science fiction. Robotic decoys built to mimic the heat signature of prey, drones scanning the canopy for movement, scent-trained dogs sweeping through brush, and radio-tagged scout snakes released specifically to lead researchers back to breeding females, since male pythons will travel long distances to find a mate during the season. Even with all of that effort combined, the total number of pythons removed from the wild since organized control efforts began sits at a little over 20,000 animals. Compared to a population that may be 15 times that size, it's a fraction of a fraction. Every python pulled from the swamp represented real effort and real cost, and still the population kept expanding its range northward, adapting to cooler winters better than anyone expected. Scientists studying the crisis eventually said out loud what many had assumed privately for years. Complete eradication was no longer realistic. The best the state could hope for was containment, a permanent, expensive holding pattern against an animal that had already won the numbers game. What made the removal effort so frustrating wasn't a lack of trying. It was the animal itself. A python's camouflage is close to perfect against sawgrass and shadow, and the species can go long stretches without feeding, which means even a well-trained searcher can walk within a few feet of one and never know it's there. Hunters describe the work less like tracking and more like searching for a single needle in a field of identical haystacks, except the needle could also grow to 20 feet long and swallow prey the size of a deer whole. Footage of pythons wrestling full-grown alligators for dominance eventually made its way online, underscoring how far up the food chain this newcomer had climbed in barely 2 decades. For a wetland that supports tens of millions of dollars in fishing, birdwatching, and flood control every year, that kind of unchecked apex predator wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to the economic and ecological function of one of the most important wetlands in the country. While the python itself dominated headlines, researchers studying the invasion stumbled onto something smaller and, in some ways, more unsettling. The pythons had brought a stowaway with them from Southeast Asia, a parasite called the snake lungworm. It moves through the ecosystem in stages. Infected pythons pass the worm's eggs in their waste. Insects such as cockroaches feed on that waste and pick up the parasite. Frogs and lizards eat the insects. Native snakes eat the frogs and lizards. By the time the parasite reaches its final host, it settles into the lungs, where it feeds and reproduces, often causing severe respiratory damage in native species that never evolved any resistance to it. Field biologists have since documented the lungworm in more than a dozen native snake species across a growing swath of the state, with confirmed cases stretching well beyond South Florida and into the northern counties. The infection is frequently fatal in smaller native snakes, and unlike the python itself, the parasite doesn't need its original host to keep spreading. It has become self-sustaining within Florida's native snake populations, which means even a hypothetical total removal of every python in the state would not make the lungworm disappear. Interestingly, one native species, the Florida cottonmouth, appears largely resistant to the parasite, and nobody yet knows exactly why. It's one of the only pieces of good news in an otherwise grim discovery, and a reminder that this invasion had layers most people never heard about. It was against this backdrop, decades of failed removal efforts, and a parasite crisis nobody could contain, that Florida wildlife officials made an announcement that seemed to invite ridicule. They were releasing hundreds of native, non-venomous snakes back into the wild specifically to help fight the python problem. To a public already exhausted by years of the swamp is full of giant snakes headlines. The idea of releasing more snakes sounded like satire. Social media reacted exactly how you'd expect, with jokes comparing it to famous ecological blunders, like the introduction of mongooses to Hawaii that ended up creating a whole new invasive species problem instead of solving the original one. What almost nobody outside the conservation community understood was that this plan wasn't improvised. It was the product of decades of quiet, patient work, and the animal at the center of it wasn't some random substitute. It was a species that had once ruled this exact landscape long before pythons ever arrived, and whose disappearance had gone almost as unnoticed as the python's arrival. The eastern indigo snake is, by almost any measure, an extraordinary animal. It can grow past 8 feet long, with scales that shift between deep blue and black depending on the light, and a throat marked with a soft reddish-orange patch that makes it instantly recognizable. It is non-venomous and by snake standards remarkably calm around people. But within its own ecosystem, it was an apex predator with almost no equal. Indigos eat an enormous range of prey, including rodents, birds, frogs, turtle eggs, and other snakes, venomous or not. They are naturally resistant to rattlesnake venom, which means a bite that would kill most animals barely slows an indigo down. Rather than constricting prey the way many large snakes do, an indigo typically just overpowers and swallows it, unfazed by the struggle. At its healthiest, the species ranged across nearly 90 million acres, from Florida up through Georgia and as far as Mississippi, thriving in longleaf pine forests and sandy scrub. But that range collapsed almost entirely over the 20th century. Logging and agriculture erased most of its habitat, leaving